People taking prescription drugs today report that it's either somewhat or very difficult to afford them. Nationwide, as an old budgeteer, I worry about these numbers. We spend about $500 billion annually on drugs, and 2/3 of that is at that local pharmacy office. And the projections from the administration are that those retail prices will continue to grow close to 6.5% over the next decade. So today, BPC is releasing a study that looks at two possible tools for controlling prescription prices, one referred to as external reference pricing and internal reference pricing. Dr. Anand Parakh, who helped lead this study, will briefly summarize it following my remarks here. And Anand will be followed by two experts in today's debate. Unfortunately, as is always, best laid plans of mice and men. Dr. Wendell Primus, who was to be here this morning, and he was the chief medical advisor for Speaker Pelosi and the primary staffer who was involved in drafting H.R. 3, the Lower Drug Cost Now Act, at the very last minute had to cancel out, largely because we're having a markup of that particular piece of legislation in the Ways and Means Committee in about 25 minutes here, and he had to be there. But Wendell was very kind enough to secure a substitute at the very last minute here, who is just as Drug Pricing Act S977. By the way, Senator Scott's legislation mirrors in many elements, in many ways, the President's own proposal, President Trump's own proposal to apply an external reference pricing process, sometimes referred to as International Pricing Index, an IPI, but it was to be, the administration's proposal, as many of you know, was to be applied to a select number of Part B drugs. The panel discussion following Christie's remarks will be led by Dr. Ovik Roy. Ovik is president of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, and he's based in Austin, Texas. And Ovik also a key advisor on this study and a real help here to BPC on a number of issues that we deal with. I must note that our panel discussion will include an international aspect of it in scope if our technology works, in that we will be joined by Dr. Sabine Vogler, Skyped in from Austria. Finally, before I turn this over to Anand to briefly outline the study, I want to pay particular thanks to the Arnold Foundation for their support of this work. So, Anand, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. A little bit of a rainy fall morning here in Washington, D.C. I think Bill teed our event this morning up really well. I want to take a couple of minutes just to summarize the key findings from today's report. It's now available online. So hopefully all of you here have a copy. All of you watching via webcast can take a look at it. As Bill mentioned, for this study, BPC chose to examine two tools utilized by many countries around the world to control drug costs, external reference pricing, which has received a fair bit of attention, as well as internal reference pricing. So our study looked at both of these tools. External reference pricing, as you know, uses international prices as a benchmark to determine the prices of drugs. It's the basis of the administration's International Pricing Index model, a proposed demonstration model. It's also the backstop, as you'll hear from Christie, to negotiation in Speaker Pelosi's H.R. 3 bill, the Lower Drug Costs Now Act. Internal reference prices uses the prices of therapeutically equivalent drugs, you'll hear that term a lot today, to serve as a benchmark to determine the price of a particular drug. The methodology for the paper and the report being released today consisted of a literature review, roundtable discussion with policy experts, and meeting with individual stakeholders. BPC spoke with representatives from industry, payers, pharmacy benefit managers, purchasers, patient groups, experts from think tanks, as well as academia, as well as received input from policymakers in the administration, as well as staff on the Hill. In terms of the findings, the paper found that external reference pricing is used in 36 countries across Europe and more than 24 countries worldwide. In general, there is significant heterogeneity in how external reference pricing is utilized, with differences ranging from whether the tool is used as a sole or main pricing policy or as an adjunct, the specific sectors the tool is deployed in, the number of reference countries, the types of prices utilized in comparisons, the formula used to determine the reference prices, and the frequency of price revisions, to name a few. While the variation in approaches makes it difficult to assess outcomes attributed to external reference pricing, existing research demonstrates that external reference pricing can lead to lower medicine prices immediately, but this effect may diminish over time. More robust price decreases may occur with more frequent price revisions and the use of real prices paid by payers as opposed to list prices. Some studies did point to possible unintended consequences, such as higher pricing in low-income countries, manufacturer launch delay in countries with lower prices, as well as short-term discouragement of investment in research and development. With respect to internal reference pricing, the study found that it's used in 22 countries in the European Union. Existing research studies suggest that internal reference pricing policies may reduce drug prices and expenditures by increasing the use of the reference drug in lieu of the more expensive product. Our review did not find an association in studies between clustering therapeutically equivalent drugs and health harms for patients. Based on the findings today, today's report proposes that policymakers consider the following actions. With respect to external reference pricing, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services could consider implementing a pilot program using external reference pricing for a subset of Medicare Part B or Part D single-source brand-name drugs or biologics that are relatively expensive and face limited to no competition. The report finds that implementing any external reference pricing scheme would require building an infrastructure to collect and update comparable data from various countries. While BPC is not endorsing a specific application of external reference pricing as currently proposed by lawmakers, the administration, or policy experts, a main takeaway of today's report focuses on how such a tool should be implemented if policymakers proceed, applying lessons learned and best practices from other countries, and adhering to these have the potential to increase the affordability of drugs in the United States while minimizing unintended consequences. One important resource to this end is the EUROPID, European Union Health Program 12 Guiding Principles, which are meant to serve as best practices for countries in establishing external reference pricing schemes. With respect to internal reference pricing, the report offers two main takeaways. First, to implement internal reference pricing for pharmaceuticals more systematically in the United States, policymakers should consider efforts to catalyze assessments of therapeutic equivalency in various ways. For example, supporting the reauthorization of the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, PCORI, and HHS deliberating on how to support assessments of quote-unquote comparability within its regulatory apparatus at FDA and CMS. Both of these are important first steps. Additionally, HHS could consider establishing an advisory group or task an existing office to look at the added incremental benefit of any new brand name drug or biologic compared to potentially therapeutically equivalent drugs or the standard of care. To inform HHS's efforts, federal funding could be provided to multiple private sector research organizations to undertake these studies. The office or advisory group could review the data received from these studies, including information from manufacturers as well as other countries, and publish an expert assessment. This information would help inform private sector price negotiation of drugs and public sector internal reference pricing policies. As a further consideration, the U.S. could also consider strengthening its cooperation on health technology assessments with the European Union to help establish common assessment methods and facilitate data sharing to better ascertain the added comparative value of new medicines. Second, and predicated upon strengthening the research infrastructure to establish therapeutic equivalency, the report makes it clear that implementation of any internal reference pricing scheme utilize a transparent process involving multi-sector stakeholders to accurately identify therapeutic classes and determine therapeutic equivalency. With respect to instituting specific internal reference pricing policies, Congress could undertake a variety of steps, including providing CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, authority to implement least costly alternative policies for Medicare Part B, and the functional equivalent standard in the hospital outpatient prospective payment system, as well as providing the HHS Secretary the authority to group biologics and the respective biosimilars into a common billing code to maximize price competition. CMS could also consider updating the Medicare Plan Finder tool with real-time information on patient cost sharing for drugs so that Part D plans can institute internal reference pricing, which has the potential to supplement efforts by pharmacy benefit managers in reducing total prescription drug costs. So in summary, today's report concludes that while reference pricing alone is not a panacea and will not address all the affordability and accessibility challenges in the U.S. pharmaceutical sector, in the right setting, focused on the most appropriate drugs, and in combination with additional pricing and reimbursement approaches, it could make a significant impact. And you'll be hearing more about the study, I'm sure, in the panel discussion today, but that is an overview of the study as well as its findings. So with that, as Bill alluded to, we'll start today's program, and Bill has already introduced Christy, but we're very lucky that she is here. As you heard, she's Managing Director at Waxman Strategies, which is a consulting firm that focuses on health, the environment, and technology. She was a senior advisor in the Obama administration's Office of Health Reform at HHS, where she had primary oversight responsibility for the coordinated and timely implementation of cross-cutting departmental initiatives, including the rising cost of drugs. Christy also spent time implementing ACA programs at OPM and the Center for Consumer Information and Insurance Oversight, CSIO. Her career in policy started in patient advocacy with the American Cancer Society and Easter Seals. We're very pleased to host Christy today. Christy.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for the Bipartisan Policy Center for having this event, as well as their report that they just published. I know I'm not much of a substitute for Wendell, so I'll try to do my best. With Waxman Strategies, we really got involved in this issue of drug pricing because of Henry Waxman's long legacy of working on these issues and trying to find a balance between innovation and affordability and price, like in the context of price competition. And so we've kind of seen over the last couple of years that this balance has gotten out of whack, and we need to replace the balance. We need to restore it. And so one of the things that has been really interesting is as you're starting to look at the changing pharmaceutical marketplace, we're seeing, like in 2008, that 1 in 3 drugs was actually new in class, which I think everybody would say that's innovation, something we haven't seen before, pretty amazing. 2/3 of drugs approved in 2018 were actually either line extensions, minor modifications to existing drugs, or they were a me too, something that we might be looking like something very similar that's already on the market. And so that, coupled with historic prices and price increases, really, I think, led to Pelosi and the committee leadership in the House saying we need to do something, and they came up with H.R. 3. So I'm going to go over a little bit about H.R. 3, what's in it, talk a little bit about how it compares to some of the best practices that were recognized in the report. H.R. 3 is negotiation. It requires that the Secretary identify a group of drugs that are considered high spending, both in Medicare but also in the commercial market. And then from those drugs, select a subset of them, 25 in the first year, scaling up to 35 by year 10, that have the greatest ability to have cost savings applied to them through a negotiation process. Now, these drugs are drugs without competition, so we heard a little bit about the recommendation about little or no competition. Typically, when there are brand name sole source drugs that come to market, the first generic will drop the price when it comes to market about 10%. The second will drop a little bit more. So with H.R. 3, the little or no competition is defined as 2 or more generics or biosimilars coming to market to really harness the pricing competition power of the market. And so the Secretary will negotiate the selected drugs based on not only what are prices available in international markets, selected by 6 different countries, but also looking at other costs that the pharmaceutical company would have to take on, such as R&D cost, manufacturing cost, cost of production. And so it's been really interesting to talk through, like, what does this look like, and how do we also incorporate clinical effectiveness or therapeutic equivalency. The Secretary, as part of the process, would also take into consideration what alternatives are also on the market, how do those alternatives measure up to the drug that's being negotiated, and how can we place value on that price of that clinical equivalency or equivocal advancement. So it's a form of external reference pricing that includes benchmarks from international prices by establishing an upper bound, but it also takes into account these factors that include clinical trials and alternative products, which gets to the internal reference pricing that we've talked a little bit about and that's referenced in the report. I just want to make sure that everybody notes that H.R. 3 does not allow the Secretary to take into account quality adjusted life years, or to discount the value of a drug on the basis of someone's age, their abilities or disabilities or their illness. And so it's really about, does this drug perform what it says it's going to perform? How does it fit within the market? And what is the maximum fair price that we can apply to this so that we can save money? Pharma is a very unique industry, not only because it brings us many life-saving drugs and some amazing treatments such as the Hep C cure, but because it was a market that was created through acts of Congress. Most notably started with Hatch-Waxman creating the generic drug market and bringing some protections such as FDA exclusivities into the market to make sure that they recouped their cost and gave them the incentives to really invest in R&D, invest in new spaces, along with the Orphan Drug Act. But also along the years, we've expanded coverage through the Medicaid Drug Rebate Program, through Medicare Part D, through the Affordable Care Act. So in giving all this market power to the pharmaceutical manufacturers, we got to figure out how to find the balance of that market power that they've gotten and the purchasing power that they've received with the purchasing power of the American people. And so I just want to say that, you know, the status quo right now is not sustainable. H.R. 3 is really meant to give a better balance and to improve price affordability while preserving our innovation that we've so much prized. And that this broad power to negotiate where market forces cannot bring prices lower is really the focus of H.R. 3. It is not meant to negotiate all drugs. It is meant to negotiate the drugs where we can actually gain savings, small number, where there's not price competition, and we know that that we may be overpaying. And so how do we get to a better price, and a better price for not only Medicare beneficiaries, but also for employers, for patients? How do we negotiate for our country? So it makes these negotiated prices available for all Americans. I will also want to add that H.R. 3 does more than just negotiation. Negotiation is really about launch prices and negotiating when there's not price competition for a selected number of drugs, but it also includes provisions such as a rebate and penalty based on inflation that would discourage manufacturers from increasing prices unnecessarily. It also includes a redesign of Part D that is really supposed to get to how to design the incentives that are in Part D to get to lower cost, lower prices, and save beneficiaries money. And then it's also going to include, and I think that it was in the markups manager's amendment today, some improvements to Medicare and expansions of coverage, including vision, dental, and hearing benefits. So I think there's a lot of synergy between what is in the Bipartisan Policy Center's newest report and what is in H.R. 3, notably the external reference pricing in the form of the average international market price, as well as also taking into consideration some therapeutic value and like how do we compare Me Too's, how do we compare drugs where we're seeing incremental innovations over new innovations and bringing that into the pricing conversation. So with that, I will conclude my thoughts. I just want to thank everyone for inviting me to attend.
Christy, thank you for your remarks. So I think with that, I'd like to ask our panel to come up. We'll start our panel discussion. Moderating this morning's panel will be Dr. Avik Roy. Avik is a senior advisor here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. He's the president of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. And we have 4 panelists here in person. Dr. Peter Bach, who's the director for the Center for Health Policy and Outcomes at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. As you know, sort of a noted expert in pharmaceutical policy in the United States. Welcome, Peter. Mark Booten, who's the CEO of the National Health Council. I think many of you know Mark, and the National Health Council obviously represents many patient groups and consumer groups. We have Natalie Ham, who's a senior policy analyst here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Natalie was instrumental in preparing today's report, so very happy that Natalie is on the panel. And then Mr. David Henke, who's president, CEO of Active Radar, and you'll hear and learn more about the company, but a lot of innovative work ongoing there, looking at therapeutic equivalency and essentially internal reference pricing. As Bill mentioned, We may or may not be able to make this transatlantic international sort of Skype session work with Dr. Sabine Vogler, but if she does join us, Dr. Vogler is head of the World Health Organization's Collaborating Center for Pharmaceutical Pricing and Reimbursement Policies. Her insights were instrumental in helping us produce this report as well. So she may or may not come on, but I guess at this point I'll turn it over to Ovik.
Thanks, Anand, and thanks to the Bipartisan Policy Center for organizing this event today. I also want to, by the way, give a shout out to Henry Waxman, since Christy is here. Henry Waxman has done many things over the course of his congressional career, but arguably the most important was the co-sponsorship of what we call the Hatch-Waxman Act, which was the piece of legislation which really defines how pharmaceutical competition in the United States works well. We talk a lot about drug pricing in this country, and sometimes we forget that over 90% of all prescriptions in the United States are for low-cost, affordable, off-patent generic drugs. And that's not true in most of the rest of the world. And a big part of the reason for that, in fact, the reason for that is the Hatch-Waxman Act of 1984. So with that, I actually want to start with you, Natalie, since we don't know if we have Sabina on the Skype line. You were the person who did most of the work writing this report and thinking about European models and how they could be adapted to the U.S. What did you take away from that research, and what can you tell us about the most interesting models you saw out there?
So, Ovik, we wanted to help inform U.S. policy by looking at lessons learned and experiences in European countries using internal and external reference pricing. After reviewing studies comparing pharmaceuticals' time to market in countries, we chose 3 countries that use reference pricing along with hybrid approaches using cost effectiveness and value-based approaches, as well as free pricing. So each country had its own unique hybrid approach. And we also chose those 3 countries that have the fastest time to market. So that means that patients, those drugs are available to patients in the fastest amount of time that would be acceptable to U.S. consumers. That's the rationale for choosing those countries. The countries we chose were Germany, Switzerland, and Denmark.
And among Germany and Switzerland and Denmark, can you maybe just briefly tell us a little bit about what's notable about the way they deployed these strategies?
So
let's start with Germany, maybe.
Okay.
Since Germany is most important.
So Germany is the largest pharmaceutical market for Europe. And it also it's known for having the fastest time to market for pharmaceutical drugs, so that patients can access drugs pretty much as soon as drugs are introduced to the market post-regulatory approval. Germany notably has a very transparent process and decision tree process. So although the first year after drugs are introduced to the market, the drug manufacturers determine the price of those new drugs. During that first year, there is a private yet public accountable entity called IQWiG. That stands for the Institute for Clinical Health Efficacy. And IQWiG compares whether there is incremental benefit for new drugs compared to those drugs already in similar therapeutic classes. So in 3 months, they make this assessment. Very transparent. Everyone's on the same page about it. And their report, IQWiG's report, then helps to inform the formal decision of whether that new drug has actual incremental benefit compared to other drugs in the same therapeutic classes, or if it doesn't, then that new drug then gets allocated to reference pricing, internal reference pricing. So that's the main framework for that. And going back, let me loop back to here. So if a drug does have incremental therapeutic benefit, then negotiations begin between manufacturers and the German government and the German health insurance funds, so that there's a transparent negotiating process for a certain period of time.
So this is the interesting thing about Germany, is that Germany does a bunch of different things, right? They're comparing prices across countries, which we call in this report, we call it external reference pricing. Then they do several forms of internal reference pricing, where they're both comparing a drug to maybe its generic equivalents if it's off patent, but also in cases where maybe it's not off patent or they're on patent competitors, they'll look at back when statins were all patented, or for example, maybe we look at TNF inhibitors today in autoimmune disorders, where there are a bunch of branded drugs. Germany would actually look at those as a group and say, well, do they have a certain therapeutic equivalence? Can we compare and contrast and set prices or benchmark prices based on this group of drugs which aren't chemically identical but may have similar patient benefits?
Correct.
One of the things about the Danish example, which we wrote about it when we published a paper at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity on this topic, called What Medicare Can Learn from Other Countries on Drug Pricing, is Denmark deploys that first category of internal reference pricing to the max. So they say, if you've got a drug and a bunch of generic equivalents, whichever of those is the lowest price, that's what the Danish single-payer healthcare system will pay for the drug, and then the patient is responsible for basically most of the excess cost if they want to choose one of the costlier competitors. And the reason I bring that up now is because we have a gentleman here with us who founded a company, Active Radar, that basically has brought this model into the U.S. for companies that self-insure and sponsor their own health benefits. So maybe you want to talk about that, David, and tell us a little bit about what you're doing with Active Radar.
Yeah, well, thank you. So we were able to identify that there was a big delta in the cost of medications that provided the same therapeutic benefit in a variety of drug categories. And we took the time to evaluate 65 different therapeutic categories of non-specialty drugs. The drugs that are used and prescribed for the most common, mostly chronic medical conditions in the United States, for diabetes, for asthma, for cholesterol, for hormone replacement therapy, and understand that many of the drugs in these categories have been around on the market for years and years and years. But there is a high cost variation between drugs that provide the same therapeutic benefit within the same category. Now, the big secret here is that most end users, most patients, have no idea how much drugs cost. And the same is true for most prescribing doctors. They don't know how much the drug costs. Most people have cost sharing or a copayment that they pay at the pharmacy. So their $10 copayment has no direct effect to if that drug costs $200 or $40. And so when we speak, and my company speaks to a lot of these large employers across the United States, they will come back to me and say, well, 85% of my prescriptions are generically dispensed right now. I can't be doing much better than that if 85% of my prescriptions are generic. But this is where we actually see the delta, the opportunity, because there obviously is no price regulation in the United States. Generic prices are also going up at a tremendous rate as well. So for these most commonly prescribed drugs, and I'll use brand names just for reference here, but Crestor is a very popular drug to lower cholesterol. It's now available generically. Rosuvastatin. Another drug that's been around for a long time is called Lipitor. Both the drugs are extremely effective in lowering LDL cholesterol. But if you actually look at the price of these two drugs, there's about a $25 difference between these drugs. The Lipitor, the atorvastatin being less expensive. Our program identifies this on a drug dose level, and we will create the benchmark for reimbursement for that employer for the low-cost drug in that category, the generic for Lipitor. Now, the member actually gets information with their doctor and with their pharmacist, and they have an option. It's a transparent market at this point in time. The member has an opportunity to have a conversation with their doctor and say, is it okay if I switch to this lower cost drug, or is there a medical reason why I need to be on the higher cost drug? And the member could actually make a decision at that point in time to either pay to the higher cost drug and just be done with it, or have that conversation with their doctor and switch to the lower cost drug. This way, the transparency within the cost of the drugs becomes much more apparent. So in this one case, there's one drug and it's $25 per month, but most people who are taking drugs for cholesterol are also taking drugs for hypertension. Many of them are taking drugs for diabetes. Some of them are taking drugs for depression. So we often find that the patients who are involved in the medical system are taking between 3 and 4 medications that would be impacted by a program like ours, not only saving them money, but also saving the plan sponsor money or whoever is paying for the benefit as well.
David, can I ask you, like, how successful are you at getting the patients to be aware of these tools and know ahead of time what drug costs what and how much they're going to be on the hook for if they choose a more expensive option?
So ultimately, we become a communications company. And I think that getting communication out in front of the member is the most important thing. But we just don't go to the member. We also outreach to the prescriber as well before the program goes live. We also outreach to the pharmacy as well to let them know about what the program is. And we're able to identify these touch points to the belly button. And go direct communication directly to those individuals who are responsible for that patient's care. And so to your question, when our program goes live, 85% of the people switch to the lower cost drug, the benchmark drug, within the first couple weeks. So it has an impact immediately. And this impact is actually seen as cost savings to whoever's paying for the insurance. And whether that be the government, an employer, a trust fund, or whomever, the benefit is dramatic and it is immediate.
Mark, your organization is a coalition of literally dozens of patient groups, provider groups, pharmaceutical companies. What's your take on what you've heard today about some of these models that are out there?
Well, first I want to say that if you look at the 160 million people with one or more chronic conditions in the United States, they're suffering. And I want to be really, really clear about that. Starting about 4 years ago, I began sitting down with the CEOs of the patient organizations and asking them, what was the number one thing keeping you awake at night? And to the person and to their constituents, they all said affordability and access. And when you talk to them, it was fascinating because we have sort of a spectrum of patient organizations, some with diseases that are deadly without any effective treatments, and some with highly effective treatments that are low cost, some with highly effective treatments at very high cost. And what we heard from all of them was still the same thing. Affordability and access was a problem. And when I speak with people representing conditions without cures, they used to be about driving innovation. That was their only concern. And what they're saying now is, I'm not able to get meaningful access to basic care. So there's been a marked shift in the last 5 years. So for us, driving down cost across the ecosystem is critically important, certainly drug prices. And right now, I think, Christy, you said it very well, we're in a market where the balance is not there anymore. And we feel that, and we've got to address it. And when I look at some of the internal reference policies in particular, I think there's a lot of opportunity. A tremendous amount of opportunity. The part that concerns me is that we've also got to get to value assessment. We've got to really understand where the value is.
Define that. What is value in your mind?
In my mind, I take a patient perspective, but I want to be really clear, this has to be a multi-stakeholder perspective of what value is. It's not just what the patient perspective is. But globally, we have assessments in place with very limited focus on what is value to the patient or family caregiver. And I want to bring that into the discussion and into the mix. PCORI has been around for a decade now, has done an amazing job.
Tell the audience what PCORI is.
I'm sorry. Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute was created as part of the Affordable Care Act. It has done an amazing job of really engaging patients and families, doing research differently, generating data, generating information that is relevant and important to patients. I think we have an opportunity to leverage what can come out of PCORI and that was referenced in the paper. I think there's a huge opportunity to do that. And I think we also have to start to think about how do we develop more methods to engage patients effectively in value assessment? And then how do we drive value assessment into the determination of what is value? I think that's an incredible way to drive down costs and to do it in a way that differentiates between high and low value care. I think that's the one thing that concerns me when we start to look at international reference pricing. I think there's opportunities for benchmarks to think about and look at what they're doing, but largely that has had very limited input from the patient community. It is often based on qualities, which is something I think we object to in the United States. So I think there's huge opportunity, but I want to be crystal clear. We've got to bring down costs, and I think internal reference pricing in particular, with a connectivity to value assessment, is a incredible methodology to do this.
Peter, you work at Sloan Kettering. Your position, Sloan Kettering is one of the great oncology centers in the United States, ground zero for a lot of the clinical trials that are developing the high-cost drugs of the future. What's your take on what you've heard today?
No, first of all, thanks for having me. And I won't speak about Sloan Kettering specifically. I don't represent the institution here. I just am some guy with a typewriter there who works there. But, you know, I think a couple of, or let me make several points. The first is that this report is phenomenal and deeply aspirational, but it also puts into focus how difficult the politics are here, the mechanics. So some of the things, you know, look overseas for some of these insights. You know, Germany is way eons ahead of us in terms of being thoughtful about pharmaceutical pricing and policy for sure. But it also reminds us that, you know, we couldn't get functional equivalence done. You know, two products from Amgen, based essentially on the same endpoints in trials, CMS couldn't, you know, anchor the price of one to the other in the hospital outpatient payment, some obscure formula that affects a lot of hospitals. But, you know, lobbying got that made essentially illegal. Least costly alternative, where two drugs, literally a generic drug put in with another generic drug, when put together, Medicare was not able to pay the cost of the two generic drugs put together. They had to pay a branded price for that. So we should look for these aspirational goals, but we also should be realistic. We can't get biosimilars and biologics into the same J code, a way of averaging prices so they literally compete. There's a little lag in there, and we can't get that done. So.
Well, it was possible before, right? And the Trump administration decided, no, we got to create these.
It was briefly done, right? That's exactly right. So we've got wax. Fair enough. So, but you know, consistency in market signal is really important. Yeah. So it's and you know, LCA was also, least costly alternative was also done, right? And then it was made illegal by the courts, or judged illegal. So
let me stop you there for 1 second, because you're expressing a certain amount of pessimism about the politics of this and how some stakeholders lobby for higher prices. Are we at some sort of tipping point now where the prices have gotten just so high where that political equation of old may not be extant anymore?
I mean, it's way easier to look in the past and gauge the politics of what's already happened than to look forward. I think we're at a tipping point, but I also thought we were at a tipping point about a decade ago. So I'm not, but yeah, I think one of the key trends, and I think you're the one who pointed this out to me, that has shifted the politics is the increasing use of high deductible plans and percentage-based coinsurance, a shift from when we were kids and you'd go to the pharmacy and we just paid $5 and they handed you your prescription. You had no idea, you weren't attached to the price. So I think that's brought it home. And Mark's point about affordability, which is of course directly anchored to what prices are, maybe has shifted this to some. But let me make a couple other points. One is that we have to be careful on two fronts, and I'm going to disagree with Mark, and actually I'm going to suggest that some of the concerns we hear are trumped up rather than methodologically sound. One of which is that we don't have adequate patient focus and metrics of value. And the reason is that, first of all, it's well established that quality of life is a shared objective. Disease-specific instruments have been developed with the input of patients. Those are used to adjust quality of life in all metrics. They're not perfect, but they're iteratively improving. And it's fundamental to this argument of getting rid of the QALY is actually undercutting the patient-specific voice in measurement. And so if you reframe the QALY, which is a quality-adjusted life year, a measure of survival matrixed against or indexed against quality of life, if you say we can't do that, well, then you've taken the patient voice out of measurement. And then you say, but wait, we need to have patient voices in measurement. So this is a intentional Gordian knot, largely perpetrated by people who, or entities who don't like the idea that things don't look good under a quality assessment. And so we have to be reasonable. If you're going to have, if you say you don't want quality of life measures, then drugs that eliminate blindness have zero value. Because clearly the only measure, unless they improve survival, and they've never been shown to do that, right? Drugs that improve the outcomes from cystic fibrosis, we just had a really exciting early approval yesterday on one of those. That drug has never been shown to improve survival from Vertex, which means its value would be zero if you don't take quality of life of cystic fibrosis patients into account. And so we see it branded as this, discriminate against disabled people, discriminate against the elderly. It's the exact opposite. It gives us a metric for evaluating improvements of life for people who have diseases and make their quality of life less than perfection. That is the purpose of a lot of what we do, and actually a lot of what we do at Sloan Kettering. Alleviation of symptoms.
Let me build on and bring Mark back in the conversation. So one of the other ways you could measure the cost effectiveness of a drug in theory is what money it saves in other healthcare expenditures. So let's say there's a drug that reduces the average length of stay in the hospital for a particular condition by a day. And let's say a day in the hospital costs $10,000. You could say, well, this drug is saving you $10,000 in other forms of healthcare expenditures, and that's the value of the drug. But to your point, that $10,000 savings may not capture other benefits of the drug for that patient that are not about expenditures per se, let alone survival. So Mark, maybe you can take it from here and tell us, if it's not quality-adjusted life years, what is the right way to measure the value to the patient?
Well, two things. I want to say nobody is arguing that quality of life not be included. Be very, very clear. That's not at all our position. I've not heard anybody say that.
I've read stuff that says the QALY should be banned.
I've seen a lot of folks that will say that, and I think we have concerns with QALYs. But QALY is one measurement of quality of life. It is not the only measurement. There are alternatives out there. And there's a lot of discussion, even in the UK, of shifting their model away from the QALY.
Is there a particular measurement that you've looked at that you like?
And that's why I say, as part of what we're calling for, is we think PCORI is a really good place to create alternative methods. And I want to be clear that quality of life is not the only measurement. To your point, cost is a measurement. And from a patient perspective, there's a real interesting balance that happens between how you have quality of life, how you have functionality, and how you survive. And it's really that balance between the three. And what we're saying is we want input into that balance. We're not saying that there should be no quality of life measure. There has to be quality of life measures, and we have to use it to drive down cost. But we're not comfortable with the existing framework. Neither was the Speaker Pelosi. And I think there are problems. And when I speak with the payers that are in membership, they have been driving the QALY at us for decades. And what they're coming back and saying is, actually, we're beginning to think it's not the best way to do this, and we'd like to partner with other stakeholders to figure out alternative methods that would be better, because they're seeing shortcomings in how it will be used even within their own plans, and not necessarily drive down costs. So it's, again, not at all about not measuring quality of life. That would be ridiculous. It's about doing it in a way that is informed by all stakeholders, including patients, and not excluding our perspective from the mix.
Great. Well, with that, we're going to take a break from the panel discussion, because we're pleased to have Senator Rick Scott here, who most of you know was the 45th governor of Florida until 2019, and is now the junior senator from Florida. I guess it must be good to be the junior senator from Florida. and famous to many people in the healthcare community for being the co-founder of the Columbia Hospital Corporation. He's here today in large part because he has introduced a bill earlier this year called the Transparent Drug Pricing Act, which would introduce external reference pricing, benchmarking U.S. drug prices to those of 5 other countries. So we're grateful, Senator Scott, for you being here. Please come up and tell us what you got to say.
Good morning. This is way too cold up here, by the way. So, I got up here in January, and I'm the 100th senator because I finished my time as a governor, so I was sworn in 3 or 4 days later, and it was freezing. And my wife came up with me. I said, "This is crazy." She said, "You worked awfully hard to get this job, to freeze your tail off." Well, let me thank you for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. So my background is, I built, at the time, the largest hospital company in the country. We had 343 hospitals. We were in like 37 states, and we were in Europe. And one thing that surprised me was when we started looking at their pricing in Europe, back when I was in the hospital business, how much more we were paying in the States for the same thing that we were buying things for in Europe. And so what I told the companies at the time is, I said, I don't know why I would pay more. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's not fair to American consumers, and I've got enough clout. My expectation is I'll get the same price here that I get in Europe. I'm not going to pay any more. Did everybody agree with me? No. Did people like it? They didn't send me thank you letters. But my focus was, when I was in the hospital business, was I had 343 hospitals, 135 surgery centers. I wanted to have the best pricing. I had the best patient satisfaction, and everything we could measure on quality, I wanted to make sure we won. And we were able to, because we just were relentless at holding people accountable, which is a big, it's a pain in the rear. So as governor, my primary responsibility on the healthcare side was on the Medicaid program, and we moved our Medicaid program into a managed care program. And so, other than a wonderful federal government that increased our costs at times through new regulations, we were able to stop the growth rate and stop basically the increase per patient in our Medicaid costs over the 8 years I was governor, because we had somebody that was accountable for price, quality, and service, and we held people accountable for it, and we were able to do it. So you look up here and you look at how much money we're spending on healthcare. I think it's what $3.6 trillion a year on healthcare. It's $11,000 a person. I mean, it's crazy when you look at the percentage of our compensation now as individuals we're spending on healthcare. And if you talk to the average person, they said, well, it's not really very accountable. I've done a lot of roundtables this year, and probably the group that's most furious about it is insulin. Why in the world have insulin prices skyrocketed like they have, when we haven't seen a lot of new innovation other than how the delivery system is set up? So my goal is, and what I try to do as governor is, don't try to do the grand bargains. Don't try to fix everything all at once, because it's never going to happen. I never believed grand bargains would happen, and if you do them, they're generally bad, because they were very partisan. So I introduced the America First Drug Pricing Plan with Josh Hawley, and it does 3 things primarily. One, you got to know what things cost. Right. When you go to the pharmacy, they'll be able to tell you, this is what it's going to cost if you want to pay out of pocket. This is what your copayment is. If you have insurance, they shouldn't be changing your copayment during the year. They should be able to tell you when you buy your plan what your copayment's going to be and how much you're going to be out of pocket on drugs. I mean, if it's a new drug you never took before, maybe that makes some sense. But if you're on a statin or some other drug that you're taking, they ought to be tell you what the price is going to be, and they shouldn't change it during the year. That's not fair. And next is that the American pharmaceutical industry can't charge us more than what they charge Great Britain or Germany, France, Japan, Canada. We shouldn't be paying any more. I don't know what. There's no rationale in my mind that we should be paying any more than they are. We shouldn't be subsidizing. Americans shouldn't subsidize all the research. I think these are. It's simple, it's common sense, and we ought to be able to get it done. I've done a couple other things. I have a bill on surprise medical bills. I did the same thing as governor. You shouldn't be surprised what things cost. And so we passed a bill that required, if they were on the surprise medical billing, that the payer and the provider had to go to arbitration. And by doing that, as far as I know to date, and I think that I passed that bill 2 years ago, nobody's gone to arbitration. They figured out how to work together to get it out of the, don't surprise the poor patient. I mean, the people that are providing the services and paying for the services, the fight should be between them, not with the patient. And we've also got the Prescription Drug Price Reporting Act. It's going to produce a database so everybody knows what drug prices are. So, I mean, you get it all for everything else we buy. We get all this. You can do it for cars, everything else, and we ought to be able to do it for drug prices. So we also, we spend, I think it's close to $40 billion a year, $39 billion a year with the NIH. And so I sponsored a bill with Senator Van Hollen. It's called the We Paid Act. It says if you're going to use taxpayer-funded research, then we're going to be able to make sure you don't raise your prices like crazy. I mean, if you're going to use our tax dollars to create a drug, then we ought to have an impact on what the prices are going to be. You shouldn't be able to charge you whatever you want. So I found up here, it's a pretty dysfunctional place. People don't talk together a lot. They don't work very well together. But I actually think this is no different than, I've had lots of different jobs in my life. I've been CEO of a large hospital company, founder and CEO. I built and sold a lot of manufacturing companies. I was the governor of Florida. And really, if you have a plan over here and you just work it every day, then it's not going to get done, especially this year. It's not going to get done really quickly, but you can get everything done over. It's just a matter of who's going to stay after it and keep coming up with the ideas and keep building relationships to get it done. So I'm very optimistic that we'll be able to do this. We really don't have a choice. I mean, the cost of healthcare in this country has skyrocketed. It doesn't need to cost this much. I mean, I was in the business, and my company did fine when we got paid a lot less money than what everybody in this industry is getting paid today. So I'm going to work hard with both Republicans and Democrats to get healthcare costs down. I think we need to start with drug prices, and I'm very optimistic. So thanks for the opportunity to be here. By the way, if you have, Tom Powers is with me. Tom came with me when I came up here. Most of my team came from Florida, but Tom worked with Gus Bilirakis for a long time doing healthcare. If you have anything you think, any information, anything we need to do to try to drive down the cost of healthcare in this country, don't reach out to me or reach out to Tom. I'm absolutely committed to this.
Great.
But thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Senator. Appreciate it. Great. All right. So now that we've heard from the senator and we've had some interesting discussion now, just most recently on our panel about quality-adjusted life years and other measurements of value, maybe, Natalie, could you speak to this question? When you mentioned the German example, a handful of countries, not all, but a handful of the European countries you studied are trying to do some sort of measurement of clinical value. What was your takeaway from what you studied in the European context on this front? What seemed to work? What was controversial? Is it the German model that seems the most interesting and most useful for us to draw from on that score?
Well, for one, we have the most information about the German model. In studying Switzerland and Denmark, what we found that by having transparent processes and having infrastructure within publicly accepted and enforced infrastructure within those countries, that patients know that if they want to choose a certain medication that isn't deemed the reference drug in terms of the lowest reference price, they have the option to pay the difference between that reference price determined by whatever entity in that country, specific to that country. So there's patient choice there within the countries. And as a second theme, there seems to be that there's a common understanding between government entities, private entities. It's not all just as some view, a single-payer system within Europe. We found, and we seek to emphasize in our report, and those are around pages 20 to 24 in our report, that each country has a mix of, yes, they use internal and external reference pricing, but then they take an approach that whether it's cost effectiveness in Switzerland or whether it's more value-based and even free pricing in Denmark, that it seems to be fair and acceptable within those countries. So we did find there's lessons to be learned. To Dr. Bach's point, how do we extrapolate that and apply some of those lessons learned to the U.S.? But I think there are lessons to be learned and to be applied, especially within the internal referencing aspect.
We should note that Denmark has a single-payer insurance system, but they have this consumer-driven drug pricing model. Switzerland is entirely the opposite. It's all private insurance, and Germany is mostly a private insurance system too, though some people quibble about exactly how one defines private versus public in the German context. So we definitely studied a mix of private versus public insurance system approaches in the context of this study. Maybe David, you mentioned how your work at Active Radar, you group drugs based on therapeutic category, rough equivalence in patient benefit. To what degree did you have to consider in the context of your benefit design the issue of clinical value or patient value?
That's a great question. So we do have a full-time P&T committee made up of physicians and clinical pharmacists, and we don't create the formulary. What we do is we work with an employer, for example, who has a PBM, and the PBM creates the formulary, and we evaluate the drugs that the PBM has decided to be on the formulary, and then determine which one of those are the lowest cost based on the pricing file that we get from the PBM. And then the other factors that we take into consideration are what is the cost sharing or the benefit design. Some plans have $0 copayments for maintenance drugs. And some plans have step therapy in place. And we take that into consideration when we're evaluating and building out our program. And I think it's also important to note once again that we're only evaluating non-specialty drugs. We're not evaluating drugs that treat the very expensive rare or even orphan medical conditions, just the 65 meat and potato drugs that every primary care physician writes for on an everyday basis. And this is where we see a tremendous value in terms of cost savings. And as it turns out, this becomes a very pragmatic and operationalized opportunity for a plan sponsor, for an insurer, or for a government to save money on their healthcare spend by looking at drugs that have the same therapeutic benefit but just cost a lot less. And then giving the patient a choice if they want to buy up to the higher cost drug. It's much like many of you travel on business. Your employer will reimburse for a coach seat every day of the week. If you want to bump up to first class on that flight, you're welcome to do so. You just pay out of your pocket. And we're bringing that same type of consumerism to non-specialty prescription drugs on a wide scale.
Great. Well, I've just been told that we have Dr. Sabine Vogler from the World Health Organization on the line, which is very exciting. I should say, it's good afternoon over there, right? Sabine, are you there? Grüß Gott. If you can hear us. Well, Sabine, if you can hear us and you're able to pipe in, feel free to jump in at any time and tell us what you think America has most to learn from the countries that you've studied. And you are literally the expert on European reference pricing models. So feel free to pipe in if you hear me and can pipe in. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for you to do that, let me go to Peter. You've also spent some time studying international models. Do you have any thoughts on which ones that are most interesting from your point of view that we can draw from here in the U.S.?
Yeah, like I said, I thought the report was excellent. I think a little bit, to my concerns about adoption of these bold ideas, the lack of our ability to even connect by telephone to Europe might serve as a metaphor for the challenges we face in Washington. But no, I think it's important to emphasize, and you again made this point to me, I think the first time I realized it, that these things will be, the efforts to undermine international reference pricing will begin with claims that these other countries are socialist, totalitarian price-setting entities. And the report lays out nicely that different kinds of comparative frameworks are at play, that these are market-based systems, if you will, that both the buyer and the seller have the ability to walk away. So I think that's the first piece. I actually find the German system appealing because it's thread the needle between providing early, under the thesis that really aggressively negotiating over prices or endeavoring on a lengthy, because it's detailed health technology assessment before market entry might delay access. And this idea that we're starting to cling to here as well, or get to, that kind of real world experience also matters for these products. That I kind of like the German enter and then evaluate system, where it's only after market entry where the country essentially takes prices. If I have that right,
it's free pricing. The drug company can charge whatever they want in year one, and then the German system they come in and think about.
Right, and my understanding of it, and it's nicely outlined in the report, and I've read a couple other reports, that it's only the drugs that kind of do very poorly then on that evaluation, or primarily those that then exit the market. And so Germany kind of meets this goal of kind of good access, timely fashion, get the market right pretty quickly. These are markets that last 10, 15 years in most cases. Feels like that upfront cost that they have with no clawback is a reasonable way to balance it. And I think actually in H.R. 3, the proposal originally as written would also be for drugs already on the market. So I think that kind of fits nicely.
One thing I'll point out, going back to my old days as a Wall Street biotech investor, is pharmaceutical companies, generally what they would do is they would try to launch in the U.S. first because it was the largest market, and they would try to launch in Germany next because Germany was the next largest market that was easy to get into from a regulatory standpoint, because you can get the European-wide approval, and within Europe, Germany was the largest market. So some of we should point out is, there's a lot of unwarranted attempts to correlate the way a country thinks about drug pricing and the way access to that market works.
100%.
Countries like Germany, the UK, France have a bit more leeway in the sense that those are big markets, or relatively big markets that drug companies want to get into, and so those countries have a bit more leverage to structure things the way they want. Having said that, it does seem to be clear for both the work of Sabina and others at the World Health Organization that the countries where access is the fastest to new drugs is where they do allow, at least in the initial phase, that year one phase like Germany does, the drug company can set their price and then negotiation happens later. And that seems to lead to a lot more quick access to the drug. I want to get back to Mark for a second. We've talked about a lot of different ways to describe value and how payers, whether it's insurers or the government, should think about this. We've talked about the quality-adjusted life year system that Britain uses. We've talked about, broadly speaking, quality of life, patient value. And I really want to try to narrow in on this issue of methodology. I mean, what is the right way, from your standpoint or from some of the organizations that you represent or even have encountered, that you've seen that are persuasive to you or to the people you talk to, that can help us have some sort of common evidence-based understanding of how we should define value? What kind of value should we pay for?
We're in a place of evolution when you look at how we think of patient input, science of patient input, how we engage patients, largely started or certainly was catalyzed by the creation of PCORI. We've seen it evolve into patient-focused drug development. We're now seeing it move into quality measure development. We're starting to see it bleed into how we think about how to deliver care. And I think what we're seeing is this recognition that when you engage people with the conditions, you learn insights that you didn't have before. And they're often the insights that surrogates have. And I want to be really clear, this isn't us against them. But the patient community has its own experiences. And historically, we have surrogates who speak on our behalf, whether they be providers, researchers, industry, plans, the regulator, governments. And the challenge is they speak on our behalf without actually engaging with us and understanding how we balance different trade-offs. In many cases, they're right, but in many cases, they're wrong. And that
So
was
measuring it better, basically.
measuring it better and understanding that a lot of the legacy quality measures were made without any patient input whatsoever. When you look in the academic research about journey mapping of patients, the vast majority of them were done without any patient input. And when you put it before people living with that chronic condition, they'll tell you, this doesn't look like what's happening to me. And in fact, almost all journey maps ignore the point to get to diagnosis. Whereas for many people living with chronic conditions, they spend 5, 6, 7 years just getting to the point of diagnosis. We're missing important insights that can help us understand value better. And what we're seeing in the payer community is a real shift to understand that these high-cost, complex patients have different needs. And when we actually engage with them to understand them better, we can actually deliver care that gets better outcomes at lower cost. All we're saying is we want to be part of how you determine what these measures are, what it is you're measuring, and how you set value. I don't think it's a dramatic departure from what we have now, but if you go to the quality, it starts from a basis, if you have a disability or a chronic condition, your life is worth less than somebody who's healthy. Is that really who we are as a society? I would say no. I think we can tweak these methods, we can use patient input, and we can do a better job, and we can use that to drive down costs, not just in drug pricing, but throughout the health system, and we can deliver care better.
We're going to move to...
Can I respond?
Yeah, let me give 1 second. We're going to move to Q&A in a couple minutes here. So if you've got questions, get your questions ready. There are going to be mics circulating around. But yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Peter.
Peter, excuse me.
No, it's okay. So just to be, if I understand it, you asked Mark 4 separate times now to give an alternative value metric, and Mark never did. I just said we should work on it. It is untrue that the QALY discriminates against people or says people's life is worth less. It's a question of how the metric is used. And so blaming the QALY for the fact that some treatments don't appear to do much for patients is sort of like my blaming a ruler for the fact that I'm short. It is simply a metric. And this is a shocking set of claims Mark has made about patient involvement in the development of these metrics. Patient-reported outcomes were developed by my colleague Ethan Bash at Sloan Kettering. We have 15 trials right now going on that have multiple quality of life measures running through my department. We probably have thousands of them overall across oncology. Again, the question is, do you think a treatment has value that doesn't prolong life but eliminates blindness? And if you do, and I assume everyone does, how do you ascertain that? How do you measure that? Other than saying, well, we don't want to measure quality. I mean, that is clearly a quality of life metric. Do you think somebody with severe symptoms from chemotherapies, life is made better if we have a medication that alleviates those without prolonging their life? That is a quality of life change. And any answer that is, well, we just need a better metric, ignores the reality that we have medicines today that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars that act specifically on those endpoints. And if the answer is, we just need to work on this more, it's really an answer of, let's just take that price and delay and drag this out while we pretend that we haven't been asking patients for the last 3 decades about their experiences.
Well, this is a spicy breakfast at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Mark, I got to let you respond to that.
I'm not going to go tit for tat because I don't think it's worth it, quite honestly. But I will say that patients have been striving to have input in these measures of development. And I know Ethan really, really well. We served on a committee of PCORI, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for Ethan. Ethan does this right. There's no question about it. But we have lots of measures that were done, created without patient input, and we're seeing PCORI and others go through them and systematically update them. Everybody gets value out of that. Simply put. And when you say, I don't have a method, I don't. I've never pretended to be a methods developer. I'm an advocate saying we need to be part of developing the methods. And if you have a problem with that, that's fine. But the patient community is going to continue to step up and say we have to play a role in this. We're not simply going to be passive recipients all the time. This paternalism has to stop.
Great. With that, let's go to questions. We have one over there in the beige. Please introduce yourself and tell us your name and
Hi,
who you
good
represent.
morning.
Thank you.
I'm Jennifer Bright. I'm here representing the Innovation and Value Initiative. I would just make an observation and then a question. So one observation is that I've been to thousands of these conversations over the course of probably 15 years, fighting about how we go about better capturing patient perspective. And we just keep arguing about there's only one way to do it. So my observation to Peter and to Mark is that it's not an either or, it's an additive. I concur completely with Peter that we have a metric that has been scientifically constructed and used for 40 plus years. And we can't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. However, it's completely legitimate to say it's not good enough or it doesn't capture all the aspects of value from a patient's perspective, because we don't have a measure or a set of metrics in this country that get to what you said in your opening remarks, which was, it isn't just about the price. You used the word appropriate.
So we've got 10 minutes for questions, and we need to get to some more.
Right, so my question is, I would like to hear you reflect on where we need to explore better measures of how we reflect appropriateness of choices in pharmaceuticals within the construct of understanding value, because I think that's where we all need to work harder to figure out all the different methods to get to that question.
Is that for Mark or for
For Mark
Peter?
and Peter both. I'd like to hear both
quickly,
your
if you can both
perspectives.
touch
Thank
on
you.
that.
Well, I think the purpose of measuring benefits of treatments is to determine what appropriate prices are. And if we got prices indexed appropriately to the benefits that provide patients, then a lot of these other problems are at least greatly diminished.
Mark?
I agree with your opening. It's not about qualities going out. It's about improving them and making sure the patient perspective is in there and getting at appropriateness. I think there's huge opportunity to move the ball forward on that.
Great. Other questions? Maybe on this side of the room, the gentleman with the narrow tie there. Yeah, you. Yeah. Oh, did you have somebody else? Oh, sorry, you have the mic. Excuse me. Go ahead.
That's okay. Catherine Camps with Get the Medications Right Institute. I did listen to the discussion on my way here and have been fascinated by it. One of the questions that came up, or one of the comments that came up was, I think from this gentleman, was around the patient speaking to their physician and saying, is this the right medication for me? I'm curious about, when we're talking about appropriateness, how we are talking about equipping physicians and on the delivery system side with the appropriate information to determine appropriate use of medications.
David, you want to take that?
That's a great question, and that's part of the educational component of our program. And so we truly believe that the medications in which we evaluate, again, are the non-specialty drugs that are used to treat the most common chronic conditions in the United States that any primary care physician is well versed in and well suited in. But to supplement that, we also directly reach out to the prescriber's office, both via phone, fax, and U.S. mail, to not only explain the program, but to provide the clinical and therapeutic equivalency information that most people would understand as being the basis for the recommendation. And also give them the same information on why an exception would be appropriate based upon either previous treatment, therapy, or a failure on that therapy. So we do this on the front end of the program before the program goes live as part of a communication program. And just in our global experience, because of the drugs that we're looking at, only about 1 to 2% of prescribers will agree that the patient needs to stay on the original medication because of medical necessity.
Great. Did you want to add something on that, Peter?
Only, it's this tension we have that we want drugs faster, we want the approval path to be shorter at the FDA. Perhaps we want endpoints that aren't necessarily patient-centered to get accelerated approval. And so we have actually a portfolio of very high-cost drugs on the market now where we as clinicians don't have any data to make those. And I'll just, Zolgensma, I'm not sure which way to say it, the gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy, approved based on data in only one of the 4 types of SMA, but approved for all 4. And so I don't, that's not my domain clinically, but I don't know how you then counsel a family member about this therapy when there's not a single patient with any of the other 3 types, if you have a patient with one of the other 3 types in front of you.
Great. Further questions? Has somebody got the mic down on that side? If not, maybe the gentleman in the orange, I think he was early, right there.
Hey, thanks. This is Zain Rizvi from Public Citizen. I had a question about kind of the external impacts of external reference pricing. So CBO says that HR 3 will lead to an increase in foreign prices. And on one level, you can sort of understand, you're obviously putting a lot of pricing pressure on those other markets. But on the other hand, to kind of Avik's point, is that these are profit maximizing companies, and so are you saying that they're leaving money on the table right now by not charging as much as they want initially? And so how do you think about that, and what do you think are the effects of external reference pricing? And one quick caveat is that I know there's some gaming involved, so they do delay launches in low price settings, but I'm just curious more about the price aspect.
Peter or Natalie, maybe one of you two want to take that?
I kind of want to hear your answer.
Oh, well,
I'm calling on you.
Okay, well.
I yield.
It'll be interesting to see. I mean, if the United States were to adopt reference pricing, there's no precedent for that necessarily, so we don't know if that would lead to higher prices anywhere else. But what I could say is that certainly in our research, what we've seen is that each country is its own entity. If you are Pfizer or Novartis or Amgen or whoever it is, and you want to sell your drug into France or Germany, you could try raising your price. But if France said, and you have leverage over France, because let's say you've cured hepatitis C, then France, as a government, as a country, wants cures for hepatitis C to be available to their population. So you, as a drug company, if you're Gilead, you have leverage over France. But if you charge $1 billion per patient and France says no, then you lose that market. So it is actually a negotiation in both directions. I think that it's not that the drug company can just name its price and everybody else will just accept it in those other countries, but nor is it simply that country being able to dictate price to the pharmaceutical company if their drug actually does have value. The innovator, the drug company manufacturer does have leverage, and that's what markets are all about. And in fact, one way we don't think about it, I'll tell you, the Trump administration certainly makes this argument with their reference pricing model, is that when Gilead negotiates with France or Germany or Japan, that is a market-based negotiation, even if they are negotiating with a government payer, because there's effectively a bidding process or a negotiation between, in their case, like a large insurance company. It's the equivalent of, in the US context, of large insurance companies. That's how they see it. For better or for worse. We got a question here in the middle. I don't want to neglect the middle of the room here, particularly as we're BPC.
Thanks. I'm Jimmy Colker. I used to be in Global Affairs Department of Health and Human Services, and it follows up right on that. You mentioned in the report, if I read it correctly, the U.S. should consider the European Union's health technology assessment process. And I know from the Obama administration that we were cautious about that because it can be characterized or as caricatured as a death panel. Here's a drug that will save your life, but it's so expensive and there's so few people who could benefit from it that we're simply going to say we as the public sector aren't going to pay for it, our insurance company isn't. And I wonder if you could put that in this context. Will external pricing result in what some opponents would say, well, we're preventing people from access at any reasonable price to a drug that could save their lives?
I think your answer would be no, Mark, or Peter, and maybe Mark, you would have some concerns about that.
Actually, no. I think we should have value assessment. I think it needs to be part of what we do in the U.S. And I think the notion of kicking it to another country, I don't think is the right way to do it. I think we need to come together and decide how we're going to do it.
Great.
But yeah, I think that the idea that people would abandon the U.S. market is, at least in the static case, unlikely.
Great. Well, with that, we're low on time. I want to give the floor back to Anand to make some closing remarks. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to the panel.
Ovik, thank you, and once again, thank you to the panel. Just tremendous conversation. I know Sabine is probably in Austria wanting to chime in, but unfortunately we weren't able to be able to connect with her. I want to thank Christy Martin as well for her opening remarks. Great that Senator Scott was able to join us as well. Thanks to everybody who joined us today for your excellent questions. Hope you picked up once again BPC's report today. Those of you on webcast, please go to bipartisanpolicy.org to see a copy of the report. I want to once again thank Arnold Ventures for their support of this project. Also thank the team, Natalie Ham, Collier Fernikes, Kate Castling, Joanne Donnellan, and others here at BPC for the tremendous work on the report. We hope that it's helpful to you, helpful to policymakers. Hopefully there are insights there that are valuable to move the conversation forward. So thanks, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.